It began in silence, the kind of silence that Paris knows on a Sunday morning when the fog rolls in from the Seine and the shutters of the cafes remain closed a little longer than usual. There was a wedding that never took place, a bride who never reached the altar, and a ripple of unease that spread across the narrow streets like the echo of a church bell no one remembered hearing. Commissioner Maigret, pipe smoke curling slowly around his face, stood at the window of his office at the Quai des Orfèvres and felt that peculiar pressure in the air he knew so well, the pressure that spoke of secrets pushing against the edges of everyday life, threatening to break through in strange and tragic ways. Before we follow him into the shadowed streets and witness the unraveling of a mystery steeped in whispers, I invite you to stay with us on this journey. If the rhythm of Maigret's Paris, the clatter of trains at provincial stations, the flicker of gaslight in misted alleys, the stubborn humanity of men and women under suspicion holds you as it has countless readers and listeners, then I ask you to linger, to share this story, and to return for the ones yet to be told. Your presence, your voice among others, allows these tales to continue alive in their smoky atmosphere. The bells of Saint-Étienne should have rung that morning, and perhaps they did, but no one seemed to hear them above the thickness of the fog. It was a Sunday in early autumn, one of those days when Paris lingers between warmth and chill, as though undecided whether to surrender fully to the season. The Seine was hidden beneath a blanket of mist, the barges moored along its banks half ghostly, their outlines blurred like sketches in charcoal. Shutters remained drawn on many windows, and even those few who ventured into the streets walked more slowly than usual, their footsteps muffled on damp cobblestones. Maigret had been at his desk at the Quai des Orfèvres since 8 o'clock, not because the case had yet been reported, but because something in the atmosphere had stirred his instincts before the telegram arrived. He sat, as always, with his pipe clenched between his teeth, smoke rising in lazy curls toward the ceiling. The air was heavy, oppressive in a way that had nothing to do with weather alone. It was, rather, the silence that weighed on him, the absence of sound where one expected it, the distant ringing of bells, the chatter of Sunday markets, the laughter of children darting between the legs of grown men. That silence carried with it the unease of a secret, as though Paris itself were holding its breath. The telegram came shortly after 9, its delivery boy damp with mist and still shivering from his ride across the river. The paper was creased, hurriedly scrawled. Maigret read it without lifting his eyes to the young man, then set it aside with the same slow gravity with which he tamped tobacco into his pipe. A bride, it said, had vanished on her way to the altar of Saint-Étienne. No further details, only the terse instruction that the police must be informed at once. By 10, Maigret stood outside the church itself, collar turned up against the damp. The square was almost deserted. A few carriages lingered, their drivers stamping their feet for warmth, glancing from time to time toward the heavy oak doors. The fog thickened around the spire so that the upper stones dissolved into whiteness. It was as though the church had been swallowed by its own breath. Inside, the air was cool and carried the faint scent of extinguished candles. The pews, polished smooth by generations of worshippers, shone dully in the pale light filtering through coloured glass. A small congregation had gathered, uncertain what to do in the absence of a bride. The groom sat alone in the front pew, his head bowed, hands clenched so tightly they seemed carved of stone. He was a young man, scarcely 30, his face pale and drained of its promise. From time to time he looked toward the side door through which she should have entered, as though each glance might conjure her at last, white dress trailing, veil trembling, with nervous anticipation. but the door remained shut, its hinges cold. Maigret did not speak immediately. He observed, as he always did, letting the silence speak first. The families were present, dressed in their best Sunday clothes, their expressions shifting between embarrassment and dread. No one dared say aloud what each of them suspected, that the bride's absence was more than tardiness, that it was final in a way none wished to acknowledge. At last Maigret approached the young man, his heavy overcoat brushing the stone floor. "Monsieur," he said quietly, not unkindly, "tell me when you last saw her." The groom lifted his eyes, wide and unfocused, as though he had been addressed from a great distance. His voice broke when he spoke, a single word, her name, followed by an explanation so fragmented it seemed more like a dream than a recollection. She had left her parents' apartment half an hour before the ceremony. She had been radiant, though nervous, her bouquet in hand, her veil arranged by her mother. She had stepped into the street accompanied by a cousin meant to escort her to the church. Somewhere along the short journey, no more than 5 streets, she had disappeared. The cousin had arrived alone, flustered, swearing she had lingered for a moment to adjust her shoe, and when she rose, the bride was gone, as if dissolved into fog. It was absurd, and yet there it was, spoken with trembling lips before a silent church. Maigret drew on his pipe, though the ember had nearly died. He studied the cousin, a girl of 20, with wide, frightened eyes, her gloved hands twisting one another until the seams threatened to split. She repeated her story exactly as though clinging to its precision would protect her from disbelief. No one contradicted her. Yet Maigret felt the tension in the air, the faint tremor in voices, the sideways glances exchanged when they thought themselves unobserved. It was not disbelief that kept them silent, but knowledge of something more. Stepping outside once more, he stood on the church steps and let the fog envelop him. The carriages were still there, their horses shifting uneasily. Across the square, a café stood shuttered, its windows clouded from within, though Maigret knew the regulars were inside. Even now, though it was early for drinking, there would be men gathered around tables, their words low, their eyes on the door. They would know already, for news travelled swiftly in Paris, especially when it was unwelcome. He lit his pipe afresh and watched the smoke mingle with mist. Somewhere in the unseen distance a barge horn moaned, low and mournful, carrying over the river. He thought of the bride, her white dress bright against the grey, her footsteps vanishing on wet stones. The city was vast, but it was also intimate. Secrets could not remain hidden long, yet they had a way of twisting themselves into shapes difficult to untangle. By noon the square had emptied. The congregation dispersed reluctantly, whispering to one another, their footsteps echoing against the church walls. Only the groom remained, his head still bowed, as though refusing to leave until the altar itself confirmed his loss. Maigret remained too, standing not far away, the weight of the case pressing already against him. He had handled murders, thefts, scandals of every kind, but there was something in this silence that disturbed him more than any cry of violence. A bride who vanished between her doorway and her altar? What crime was this, if crime it was? The question hung in the damp air like the fog itself, unanswered, pressing against his temples until his pipe had gone out once again. Evening came slowly, with the lamps along the square glowing faintly through the mist. The church bells rang vespers, their sound muffled, absorbed by the thickness of the fog. Somewhere, in one of the narrow alleys that led away from Saint-Étienne, footsteps lingered too long, a shadow moved where none should have been. Maigret did not follow, not yet. He allowed the city to hold its breath a little longer, knowing that the first movement of air would reveal the direction of the wind. and so the day ended as it had begun, in silence. The altar remained bare. The groom departed at last, with the weight of shame on his shoulders, and Maigret returned to the Quai des Orfèvres with more questions than answers. But within him stirred the certainty that the bride had not vanished into thin air, nor into fog. Somewhere in Paris, behind a shuttered window, or along the banks of the Seine, her absence spoke louder than presence, and Maigret would listen until the city yielded its truth. Maigret crossed the square with the deliberate slowness of a man who knows the city will yield more to patience than to force. The fog still clung to the paving, stones, less dense now, thinning into strands that drifted against his coat as he approached the café with its steamed panes and shuttered mood. He paused before the door, heard inside the discreet clink of porcelain, the soft scrape of a chair pushed back, and the low murmur of voices that fell quiet in the way voices do when they sense an interruption from the outside world. Then he pushed the door and went in. The warmth struck him first, the mixture of coffee, damp wool, and old smoke that lives in the wood of a familiar room. A single kerosene lamp burned on the counter, though it was still daylight, its yellow flame making a small halo against bottles lined up like patient soldiers. A few men sat at the back beneath a clock that ticked with the stubbornness of habit. They looked up, some with curiosity, some with that polite indifference Parisians wear like a coat. At the nearest table, an abandoned newspaper lay half-folded, a headline about a provincial scandal, and, beneath it, a small item about a pickpocket at the Gare du Nord. Nothing yet about the vanished bride. News would come, of course, but not yet. The patron, a woman with iron-grey hair, pulled into a severe bun, wiped her hands on her apron, and gave him a glance without flinching. She knew who he was without asking. In this quarter, Maigret's heavy silhouette and pipe were as recognizable as the brass number on the door. She nodded once and said, "Monsieur le Commissaire," in a voice as calm as the polished counter beneath her cloth. He asked for coffee, and while she turned to the machine, one of those brass-beaked monsters that breathe and hiss like a small engine, he studied the room without turning his head. At the corner table, two men pretended to read, though their pages never moved. At the window, a thin fellow with peppery hair blew on his hands and stared at fog as if it owed him money. The air was thick with waiting. The coffee was strong, dark, a little burnt at the edges the way he liked it. He took one sip and warmed his fingers around the cup. Only then did he ask, almost lazily, as if it scarcely mattered, whether the café had been busier earlier. The patron shrugged. Sundays were always uncertain. Weddings were unreliable business. The parties sometimes came here for a celebratory drink, sometimes not. There was to be a wedding at Saint-Étienne, she added, not as a question. The bells never carried. They carried, said the thin fellow by the window without turning, just far enough for the pigeons. He smiled at his own wit, but the smile died quickly when the patron shot him a look that said, "Mind your tongue." He bent his head again, chastened. Maigret did not hurry. He let the silence return. He drew a match and lit his pipe, the flames swelling, then dimming, the tobacco catching with a faint rustle like dry leaves. He thought of the cousin's story, a shoe adjusted, a glance downward, a gown lifting at the hem, a second of privacy in a city that allows none. In that second, someone steps close, or a door opens, or a carriage that was not there is suddenly there, inviting, its leather smelling faintly of rain and horse. These were not conclusions, merely possibilities that rose with the smoke. When he asked whether any woman in white had passed the café that morning, The patron set down her cloth with the precision of a person placing a stone on a grave. "No white," she said. "A ribbon, perhaps, but no white." The two readers looked up too quickly. The thin fellow at the window stole a glance at the corner table and caught himself as if he had stepped into the middle of a street without looking both ways. Maigret did not look at any of them. He remained as he was, his eyes on the steam that drifted from his cup. "If a bouquet had been left here," he said, "you would have kept it in water. You keep things alive." It was not a compliment, not exactly, but it had the weight of one. The woman's mouth twitched, one of those small movements that could be humor or pain. "Nothing was left," she said softly. "Only a glove." The room moved then, just a little. The clock ticked louder, the men at the corner table breathed with care. The glove appeared from beneath the counter, produced the way a witness produces a memory he has been holding back. Caramel-coloured kid, delicately stitched, the buttons still fastened. It was small, elegant, and smelled of faint powder, and the dust that collects in a drawer, not often opened. "Found by the door after the morning rush," the patron said. "I meant to mention it to the church sacristan when he came for his coffee. He didn't come." Maigret turned the glove in his palm. A glove was a curious thing to lose. Women sometimes removed them to count coins, to fix a veil, to touch a cheek. If you dropped one, you usually noticed, unless your mind was elsewhere, unless a hand larger than your own had taken your elbow and guided you. He examined the inner cuff. A name could have been written there, as seamstresses sometimes did, but it was clean. He returned it to the counter, and the patron slipped it back under like a secret. "I'll leave it with you for now," he said. "It belongs to someone who will miss it." "It belongs to someone who missed something else first," she murmured. She seemed to regret the words as soon as they came. Her eyes drifted to the corner table, where the two readers had given up all pretense. One of them, a dark-haired man with features too handsome for his own safety, turned the newspaper over and over without reading a letter. The other, older and stout, watched Maigret openly, the way a man watches a dog he cannot decide is friendly. The door opened, a draught slipped in. Janvier appeared in the frame, cap in his hand, the skin of his cheeks pinked by cold. He nodded to the patron with a respectful "Madame," and came to stand beside his chief. "We traced the cousin's route," he said in a low voice. "No one saw the bride after the corner of Rue des Ursulines. A fruit seller remembers a carriage, black, curtains half drawn, no crest." He hesitated. The fruit seller also remembers a man on the pavement who looked at his own shoes a great deal. Maigret inhaled, exhaled. Did the fruit seller know the time? Just after the bells would have rung, if they had rung for anyone who listened. The patron's cloth rubbed an invisible stain on the counter. She was remembering something. Maigret saw it like the tremor of a fish beneath the surface. He did not press. He asked Janvier for the name of the fruit seller, and the younger man gave it, along with the exact corner where the stall had been set up, the cobbled gap that carried water to the gutter, the broken drain that made passers-by step wide or get their ankles wet. These small details pleased Maigret. They were the stuttering syllables of the city's speech, and they sounded true. He left Janvier with the faintest nod and crossed to the window, where condensation turned the outside world into a watercolour. With his sleeve, he cleared a small circle and looked out at the square. The fog was lifting at last. The black bark of plane trees showed dark and wet. The church doors remained shut. On the far side, a woman hurried past with a basket, her scarf tied beneath her chin, her body bent forward as if she were walking into rain that existed only for her. When he turned back, the handsome man at the corner table had risen. He made a show of counting coins, overpaying slightly, a generosity that would not be forgotten. He wished the patron a pleasant day, addressing her by name, though he ought not to have known it, and tipped his hat to the room. As he reached the door, he paused, hand on the latch, and for the first time allowed his gaze to meet Maigret's. It was a careful gaze, neither hostile nor friendly, the gaze of someone weighing distances. Then he was gone, leaving behind the faintest scent of cologne, lavender perhaps, and the impression of a man who owned a mirror and did not mind it. "Who is he?" Maigret asked. The stout reader answered before the patron could, his voice low and pleased to be useful. "Calls himself Armand Lenoir, comes and goes, plays cards, but never too well. Tips like a man who wants to be remembered and forgotten at the same time. Where does he live?" The patron hesitated, then said what she had not wanted to say. "He receives letters poste restante at the boulevard. He says he is a buyer of fabrics. There is nothing in his pockets that would suggest that he buys anything but time." Maigret's pipe had gone out again. He did not relight it. He saw the glove under the counter. He saw the black carriage without a crest. He saw a bride adjusting her shoe, and a man studying his own laces as if they held the solution to a riddle. He saw, too, the cousin's frightened hands twisting themselves into knots, and the groom's shoulders rounded as if he had been told to carry a sack of flour through the rain. He asked for the glove once more and slipped it into his coat, promising a receipt later. The patron did not ask for the paper now. She nodded, grateful and resigned, like a woman handing over an heirloom to a relative more stable than herself. At the door, Maigret paused and, with a small movement of his head, indicated the stout reader. "If Monsieur Lenoir returns," he said, "you will let Inspector Janvier know, quietly." Outside, the air had cleared enough to show the lines of the buildings, their damp stone faces streaked like the necks of old pigeons. The sound of a distant train carried faintly across the river, the long metallic sigh of something departing, something arriving. It would be a provincial train, he thought, one of those that stopped in towns where news travelled by word of mouth, and the station-master kept a notebook in which he recorded not only schedules, but suspicions. Janvier fell into step beside him. "You think she got into the carriage, patron?" "I think," Maigret said, "that someone arranged for the city to be looking the other way. Fog helps, but it does not do the work alone." They walked toward Rue des Ursulines, toward the fruit seller, who watched shoes and carriages and the hands that exchanged coins. As they turned the corner, a boy ran past with a bundle of newspapers under his arm, shouting headlines about politics and a bank director's fall from grace. No mention yet of a bride who failed to appear. That would come later, when the city had chosen its appetite for the day. At the corner, the fruit stall had already been dismantled, the crates stacked, the cobbles damp where crushed peel had stained them. From a window above, a lace curtain moved as if someone had exhaled. Maigret looked down and found almost at once a fleck of white caught in the crack between stones. He crouched, pinched it free. A sliver of ribbon, narrow, with a single stitch still clinging like a tooth. Janvier held out his notebook without being asked, and Maigret slipped the ribbon inside, closing the covers as if they were a prayer book. "Send the glove and the ribbon to the lab," he said, though he knew the lab would only nod and confirm what his fingers already told him, that both had belonged to a woman who had not intended to part with either. They stood a moment longer, feeling the city shift around them, the fog now higher, the lamplighter not yet out, the day squeezing itself into evening with that particular Parisian sigh that meant cafes would welcome the weary and the unwilling again. "Shall we see the groom?" Janvier asked. "In time," Maigret said, First the cousin. People tell different truths in different rooms, and find an address for Armand Lenoir that is not poste restante. He sleeps somewhere. Men like that don't sleep well in rooms with other people's names on the doors. They moved on, and as they did, a carriage turned onto the boulevard, its curtains half drawn, its horse trotting lightly in the cleaned ruts. It passed them without slowing. Janvier glanced back. Maigret did not. He listened instead to the faint, hollow rattle of wheels over joints in the stone and wondered how many carriages in Paris moved like that, with discretion, with practice, with the habit of not being noticed. By late afternoon, the first rumour reached the press. A girl at a kiosk whispered to a customer who whispered to a man who had a friend who worked for a morning paper. In a few hours, ink would find paper, and the city would read its own reflection and fail to recognize itself. For the moment there was only the glove, the ribbon, the name of a man who liked mirrors, and the road between a doorway and an altar that had grown longer than anyone expected. Night would come soon, and with it the river, the bridges, and the rooms where people invented explanations in order to sleep. Maigret turned his collar up and headed toward the cousin's street, feeling the case settle, not heavier, but closer, like a coat finally buttoned in the proper holes. Somewhere, a door waited to be knocked, a lamp to be lit, a face to say too quickly, "I don't know anything." He would listen to that, to the rush of words, to the silence afterward. The city had started to speak. The telegram lay on Maigret's desk like a scrap of bone pulled from the earth, ordinary in appearance, yet containing within it the faint odour of dread. The boy who had delivered it had long since gone, his bicycle clattering down the quay, but the commissioner still stared at the slip of paper with the same quiet intensity he reserved for crime scenes. The words were brusque, stripped of ornament, as all telegrams were. Yet in their brevity they carried something of the sender's urgency, a pulse beating through the machine. Bride seen boarding provincial train, Nevers line alone. Unconfirmed. Stop. Station master insists, not mistake. Stop. The message had come from a small station south of Paris, the kind where porters smoked more than they carried bags, and where the rhythm of life was measured less by timetables than by the tolling of church bells. Maigret could almost see it, the wooden benches with their varnish worn smooth, the enamel signs pointing to toilettes and buffet, the wide clock hanging above the platform with its hands trembling as if tired of their duty. He could smell the mixture of coal smoke and damp wool, hear the echo of a whistle vanishing into the countryside. He leaned back in his chair, pipe between his teeth, smoke curling lazily upward to join the shadows that gathered even in mid-afternoon. Paris hummed outside the windows, but in his mind he was already in that station, watching a bride in her white gown step onto a train as if it were nothing extraordinary. Did she look behind her? Did she run, or did she drift forward in silence, a veil trailing on the floor like a slip of fog brought in from the river? Lucas knocked once and entered, bringing with him the smell of rain and the thin sheen of sweat on his forehead. "Word from Janvier," he said. He followed up with the cousin. She sticks to her story, claims she bent to her shoe, looked up, and the bride was gone. No hesitation, no confusion. She repeats it like a prayer. Maigret grunted, not out of disbelief, but from the weight of familiarity. He had heard such refrains before, in rooms heavy with fear. People repeated themselves not because they lied, but because they hoped the repetition might become truth. He tapped the telegram with his thick finger. "The station master says otherwise. Never. Alone." Lucas frowned. It could be a mistake. Station masters like to believe their eyes never betray them. "And yet," Maigret said, "sometimes they see too much." Enough to make a story where there is none." He rose, pulling on his heavy coat. "We'll let the laboratory examine the glove and ribbon. In the meantime, we will hear the station-master's tale with our own ears." By the time he reached the Gare de Lyon, dusk had fallen, and the station was a cathedral of steel and smoke. Lamps burned high, their light diffused in a haze of steam that hissed from the resting locomotives. Families clustered around porters, bidding hurried farewells, while soldiers in uniform smoked nervously before their departure. The vast roof magnified every sound: the whistle of an engine, the clatter of a suitcase, the cry of a vendor hawking newspapers. For all its size, the station was intimate in its own way, each life brushing against the next in passing. Maigret bought a ticket with the indifference of a man who had done so 100 times and boarded the provincial train, his heavy frame settling into a wooden seat, polished by decades of travellers. He lit his pipe and let the countryside draw itself slowly against the windows, villages slipping by in smudges of light, fields lying dark and damp under the moon. The rhythm of wheels on rails was steady, hypnotic, as though the train itself conspired to lull men into forgetting why they travelled. At Nevers, the platform was almost deserted, save for a porter asleep against a crate, and the station-master himself, a lean man with the eyes of one who saw too much of life pass by without ever leaving. He recognized Maigret at once, straightening his cap with a gesture both respectful and proud. "Commissaire," he said, "I thought you'd come. I told myself, this is too peculiar for Paris not to notice." Inside his cramped office, with its smell of damp ledgers and ink, the station-master told his story. A woman in white had stepped from the carriage as the train prepared to depart. No one accompanied her. She walked calmly, bouquet in hand, her veil half lifted as if she wished to see clearly. She had purchased no ticket at the counter. Her presence was sudden, inexplicable. He swore it was no mistake. He had seen brides enough in his time to know one when she passed. He had asked where she travelled. She had given no answer, only stepped onto the train as if drawn forward by a duty invisible to others. When he tried to follow, the whistle blew, and she was gone. Maigret listened in silence, pipe unlit in his hand. He studied the man's eyes, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the way his fingers drummed against the desk. He believed what he said, of that much Maigret was certain. Whether what he saw was truth was another matter. The countryside had a way of making myths out of mist. A white figure on a foggy platform could be a bride or a ghost. "Did anyone else notice?" Maigret asked. The station-master hesitated. "A porter thought he saw her. But porters see everything and remember nothing. He might tell you she wore red if you pressed him hard enough." Maigret rose. He left a cigarette on the desk as thanks, though he himself never smoked them, and walked back on to the platform. The train tracks gleamed under the lamps, stretching into the night. Somewhere out there was a bride, perhaps, or only the memory of one carried on by rumour. Yet the telegram had come, and with it a new path the case must follow. On the return journey, he sat alone, watching his reflection in the dark window. He thought of Madame Maigret at home, perhaps setting the table, perhaps waiting with her quiet patience that never asked questions. He thought of the cousin repeating her prayer of ignorance, of the groom staring at the altar, as though stone might explain absence. He thought of the glove, the ribbon, and now this phantom of a provincial train. When he stepped back into the night air of Paris, the city felt changed. It was no longer only a matter of fog around Saint-Étienne, of a café with shuttered windows. The mystery had stretched its fingers outward into villages and stations where time moved slower, where secrets lingered in the folds of countryside silence. He walked along the quay, pipe smoke mixing with the mist that had risen again from the river, and he felt the weight of the city pressing at his back, urging him forward. The bride had not vanished into air. She had taken a path, whether of her own will or another's. A telegram, a station master, a train, all these were threads, and Maigret, with his heavy patience, was ready to follow them into whatever darkness they might lead. The morning after his return from Nevers, Paris felt different to Maigret, not lighter for the lifting fog, but heavier with the weight of names unspoken. The bride had not appeared at her altar. A telegram had sent him on a provincial train to chase after a ghost in white, and yet all the while a certain silence had clung to the people around the case. In the groom's bowed head, in the cousin's twisting hands, in the café patron's guarded words, he had sensed a presence not yet declared. A man, perhaps, or a shadow in the shape of one. He rose early before the first trams rattled down the boulevard and walked the streets still slick from overnight drizzle. The butcher's shutters were just lifting, and the smell of fresh bread wafted from the corner bakery. Maigret's pipe glowed faintly in the grey air. The Quai des Orfèvres was quiet when he arrived, though Lucas was already at his desk, bent over a sheaf of reports. "Any word from Janvier?" Maigret asked, shrugging off his coat. Lucas nodded. He visited the cousin again, same story, word for word. Too exact, perhaps. And there is something else. Neighbours speak of a man seen visiting the bride's apartment in the evenings. Not the groom, someone taller, darker, always careful to leave before the family returned. Maigret said nothing. He tamped his pipe and relit it, letting the silence expand until it grew full enough to hold the weight of the revelation. And no one spoke of him before? No one wished to. They called him un ami, nothing more. The commissioner exhaled smoke through his nose, heavy brows lowering. A suitor, unnamed. It was always such a figure that hovered on the periphery of cases like these, the man who existed only in glances, in whispers, in the careful omission of words. Maigret had encountered him often, sometimes a phantom invented by jealousy, sometimes the very axis upon which a whole tragedy turned. He left the office without haste, taking Lucas with him, and by mid-morning they arrived at the street where the bride had lived. It was a respectable quarter, with tall grey buildings lined neatly along the cobblestones, their doors polished, their windows discreet. Maigret mounted the stairs slowly, his hand brushing the rail, each step echoing in the stairwell like a metronome counting time. The mother received them at the door, pale but determined, her eyes ringed from a night without sleep. She ushered them into the salon where curtains shut out most of the daylight. The smell of stale flowers lingered, bouquets that should have adorned a wedding table now drooped, forgotten, in vases of murky water. The groom sat stiffly in a chair, his face more hollow than the day before. He rose when Maigret entered, but the commissioner's gesture told him to sit again. The cousin was there too, her hands folded tightly in her lap, as if bound by invisible cords. The room was thick with silence. Maigret stood a moment, pipe unlit in his hand. "There was a man," he said at last, his voice steady, almost gentle. "Not the groom. He visited here, quietly, in the evenings." "Who was he?" No one answered. The cousin's eyes darted to the mother, who pressed her lips together. The groom stared at the carpet, as if the pattern might reveal a solution. "Names matter," Maigret continued. "When they are withheld, they grow heavier. Too heavy, at last, for silence to carry." It was the cousin who broke first. Her voice was scarcely more than a whisper. "He said his name was Armand. He—" He came when her parents were out. I don't know more than that. Armand. Maigret thought at once of the handsome man in the café, the one who tipped generously and carried himself with the care of a man who knew mirrors. A name too simple to be real, too convenient in its darkness. Lenoir. Black, a man of shadows. The mother spoke then, her voice firmer, defensive. He was no one, a passing acquaintance. My daughter was kind. She did not wish to hurt his feelings, that was all. Maigret's gaze shifted to the groom, who still had not spoken. At last the young man lifted his head, his eyes full of something between shame and rage. I knew of him, he said, not his name but his existence. She assured me it was nothing. I believed her. He clenched his fists. I wanted to believe her. The words hung heavy in the dim room. Outside, the streetcar rattled past, its bell clanging faintly, a reminder that life moved on regardless of vanished brides. Maigret asked questions quietly, methodically. What nights had Armand appeared? What words had been exchanged? Did he bring letters, gifts, flowers? The answers were vague, inconsistent, evasive. A scarf once, perhaps. A book. A letter glimpsed but never read. Each response only deepened the outline of the man without sharpening it. When he left the apartment, the drizzle had begun again, thin needles of rain tapping against his hat brim. He and Lucas walked in silence until they reached the corner café. There, over another strong coffee, Maigret pieced the fragments together. A glove at one café, a ribbon in the gutter, a telegram from a provincial station, and now the name Armand. The city was beginning to form a face, blurred still but discernible. Find him, Maigret said simply. Search the cafés, the card tables, the postes restants. Men who invent themselves leave traces, if only in the pockets of waiters. Lucas nodded and departed on the errand, his shoulders squared against the rain. That evening, Maigret returned home to Madame Maigret. She had prepared a simple stew, and the apartment smelled of onions and bay leaf. They ate in near silence, the commissioner chewing slowly, his thoughts elsewhere. At last, she looked at him with her quiet, steady gaze. "This man," she said, "this Armand, he is not a stranger to her heart, is he?" Maigret did not answer directly. He never lied to her, but he often withheld. "He is not a stranger to the story," he said instead. Later, as he sat with his pipe by the window, the fog returned, rolling off the Seine and softening the lamplight in the street. He imagined the bride once more, her veil lifting slightly in the damp air, her eyes perhaps searching for someone who was not at the altar. A man named Armand. A man the family wished to erase with silence. The city whispered to him then, in the sound of wheels on cobblestones, in the distant call of a newspaper seller, in the sigh of the river. It whispered of choices made in private, of shadows that accompany brides to their thresholds, of the fragile line between duty and desire. Tomorrow he would find Armand. Or at least he would find the shadow of the man who carried that name. And in that shadow he would search for the truth of a bride who never reached the altar. The morning broke with a thin drizzle that glazed the cobblestones and streaked the window panes with silver threads. Paris stirred reluctantly, carriages rolling slower than usual, pedestrians bent forward beneath umbrellas as though leaning into the very weight of the day. Maigret had been at the Quai des Orfèvres since dawn, but the documents on his desk had not moved beneath his hand. He had reread Janvier's report 3 times, each word stubbornly the same, each line offering no more than it had before. A name had emerged, Armand Lenoir, but names were smoke until held in a fist, and this one dissolved each time he tried to close his fingers. By late afternoon, the office seemed smaller, the walls closing in with their familiar stains and the smell of old ink. Maigret pushed his chair back at last, shrugged into his heavy coat, and left without announcement. Lucas glanced up from his papers, but the commissioner only nodded once, pipe clenched between his teeth, and stepped into the damp chill. He walked homeward at his own pace, letting the drizzle bead on his hat brim, letting the city whisper to him through its muted noises, the hiss of tires, the clop of hooves, the laughter of boys chasing one another along the quay. At home, the door opened to the familiar smell of Madame Maigret's cooking. She had prepared a stew that filled the apartment with warmth, and she greeted him not with questions, but with the simple quiet that had always been her gift. He hung his coat by the stove to dry, wiped his hands, and sat at the table where bowls already waited. They ate slowly, the commissioner breaking bread into his soup, the silence between them companionable. When he finally spoke, it was not in the tone of an officer recounting a case, but of a husband speaking half to himself. "There was a wedding that never happened," he said. "A bride who vanished before the altar. She left behind a glove, a ribbon. And now there is talk of a man no one wishes to name." Madame Maigret did not interrupt. She ladled another spoonful of stew into his bowl, as if sustenance might help words come more easily. She watched him with those calm eyes that never pressed, only listened. He leaned back, pipe unlit in his hand, and continued. "They say his name is Armand. They say he was no one. But silence has a way of shaping itself around someone important." She sipped her wine, her face thoughtful. "Do you think she loved him?" The question was gentle, yet it cut through the fog of his own thoughts. Maigret had avoided asking it of himself, preferring the solidity of clues, the glove, the ribbon, the telegram. But here, at the table, with the warmth of home and the comfort of a familiar voice, he let the question settle. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "or perhaps she thought she did. There is a difference?" Madame Maigret folded her hands, her wedding ring glinting in the lamplight. "When a girl is young, love can feel like escape. Sometimes escape is stronger than devotion." Her words were simple, yet they carried the weight of observation, the kind that comes not from investigation, but from a life lived in quiet attention. Maigret drew on his pipe, finally lit, and let the smoke rise toward the ceiling. He thought of the bride, her white dress luminous in the fog, her steps measured, her heart perhaps pulled in two directions. A duty to the man waiting at the altar, a desire for the man waiting in shadow. "She was seen boarding a train," he murmured, or so the station master swears, alone, calm, as if she knew where she was going, but no ticket, no explanation. Madame Maigret tilted her head. Perhaps she thought the world beyond Paris would hide her, or perhaps she wished only to be seen leaving, so no one would look closer to home. The commissioner smiled faintly. She had a way of turning things sideways, of suggesting possibilities the reports never did. He had long ago learned not to dismiss them. More than once, her quiet reflections at this very table had guided him toward truth when facts lay tangled. They finished their meal in silence, the rain pattering against the shutters. Later, in the sitting-room, Maigret settled into his armchair with his pipe, and Madame Maigret sat across from him with her knitting. The needles clicked softly, steady as a clock, and the rhythm soothed his thoughts. He spoke again, not to question her, but to shape the fog of the case into words. The groom waits like a man punished. The cousin repeats her story as if afraid silence will betray her. The mother insists Armand was no one, yet in their faces, in their pauses, he is everywhere. Madame Maigret did not look up from her knitting. "People lie less with words than with silences," she said. "You know this, Jules. You have always known it." Her use of his name, soft and familiar, drew him deeper into his thoughts. Yes, silence was often more eloquent than confession. The cousin's twisting hands, the mother's tightened lips, the groom's bowed head, they spoke of Armand as clearly as if they had shouted his name in the street. The clock on the mantel ticked steadily. Outside, a carriage passed, wheels splashing through puddles. The city breathed around them, but inside the apartment there was only warmth and quiet. Maigret felt the weight of his coat drying by the stove, smelled the faint tang of onions still lingering from dinner, heard the steady click of knitting needles. These small domestic details grounded him, kept him human amidst the shadows of other people's tragedies. When he rose at last, it was with the clarity of a man who knew the next step, even if the path beyond remained hidden. He kissed his wife on the forehead, thanked her for the stew, and went to bed with the sound of rain easing against the shutters. In the early hours before dawn had coloured the sky, he awoke with a thought that had lodged itself during the night. Armand was not a ghost. Men like him, however careful, always left a trail, an unpaid bill, a letter left unsent, a glance exchanged too openly in a cafe. The task now was not to search for the bride alone, but to seek the man who had walked beside her in silence. As he dressed, Madame Maigret stirred and asked, half asleep, "Will you find her?" He buttoned his coat, pipe already in his pocket, and answered softly, "I will find the truth. That is all one can promise." He stepped out into the cold dawn. The rain had ceased, but the streets shone wet, reflecting the first glimmers of light. Somewhere, in a hidden apartment or a shuttered cafe, Armand Lenoir existed, breathing the same damp air as all of Paris. Maigret set his shoulders against the chill and walked toward the Quai des Orfèvres, carrying with him the quiet wisdom of the woman who had reminded him that silence speaks as loudly as words. The city awaited, with its secrets folded in fog, its shadows gathering around a bride who never reached her altar. And Maigret, pipe smoke trailing in the morning air, was ready to listen. The river had a way of keeping its secrets. At night it whispered them to the stones of the quays, carried them under the bridges, and hid them in the slow eddies that swirled beneath the arches. For Maigret, the Seine was never merely water. It was the pulse of Paris, steady, patient, indifferent, and yet, somehow, knowing more than men dared confess. On that particular evening, when the lamps along the embankment glowed in wavering halos through a fine mist, he found himself walking its length as though the river itself might yield the clue no witness had yet offered. His footsteps echoed hollowly on the wet paving, and his pipe smoke drifted across the damp air. Barges moored along the quay lay heavy and silent, their ropes creaking faintly with the current. A lone fisherman sat hunched at the edge, line trailing idly, his cap pulled low. The commissioner paused near him, not to ask questions, but to absorb the atmosphere, the strange combination of solitude and watchfulness that always clung to the riverbanks at night. The investigation had moved like the river itself, slow, winding, but persistent. Armand Lenoir's name had surfaced in whispers and silences, yet his shape remained elusive. The glove and the ribbon rested in evidence drawers, mute relics. The cousin continued her litany of ignorance, and the groom drifted further into the posture of a man hollowed by absence. Only Madame Maigret, with her quiet reflections, had pierced the fog with her suggestion that escape sometimes masqueraded as love. And yet tonight Maigret felt the city narrowing, pressing him toward the water, as if to say, Here lies the next step. He stopped beneath a lamppost where the yellow light spilled onto slick cobblestones. Across the river, the outline of Notre Dame loomed faintly, its towers blurred by mist. He had arranged for Janvier to watch the cafes where Armand had been glimpsed, for Lucas to follow up with the poste restante at the boulevard. For himself, he had chosen the river. Instinct more than reason had drawn him there, the same instinct that had guided him so often before, the sense that crimes cling to certain places the way damp clings to stone. As he leaned against the parapet, a carriage rattled across the Pont Marie, its wheels striking the joints with a hollow rhythm. The sound echoed against the water, then faded. From the shadows, footsteps approached slowly, hesitantly, the tread of someone who walked without destination. A woman emerged beneath the lamp's glow. She was not the bride, but her dress carried a pale shimmer, and for a heartbeat Maigret felt the tightening in his chest that comes when the city plays tricks. She glanced at him once, quickly, then hurried on, swallowed again by darkness. The Seine at night was full of such half-glimpses, faces half-seen, gestures half-made, stories begun and broken off. But Maigret knew better than to dismiss them. He followed, not closely, his heavy stride unhurried. She turned into a narrow passage leading down to the water, where an old stone stairway descended to the quay. At the bottom, under the shelter of an arch, two men waited. They were not lovers waiting for a rendezvous, nor simple passers-by. Their stance was guarded, their words low, their heads turning with the twitchy awareness of men who feared interruption. The woman spoke briefly with them. Maigret could not hear the words, but he saw the quick gesture of her hand, the glint of something exchanged, a folded scrap perhaps, or a note. Then she departed, her steps rapid, shoulders drawn in. The two men remained. One lit a cigarette, the flare of the match revealing features sharpened by suspicion. The other leaned against the stone, his profile obscured. Maigret waited, the pipe smoke veiling his own presence. He did not step forward. Patience was his trade. The men spoke softly, their conversation drowned now and then by the ripple of water. At last, the taller of the two glanced upward, as if sensing the commissioner's gaze. For an instant, Maigret thought of Armand, the careful man who tipped too generously, who looked into mirrors. But before the thought hardened, the men vanished into the darkness beneath the arch, swallowed by the labyrinth of passages that threaded the river's edge. He descended the stairway after they had gone. The stones were slick, the smell of damp and riverweed strong. At the spot where the woman had paused, a fragment remained. Paper, torn unevenly, caught against a crack. He stooped, pried it free. It was damp, smudged, but words clung faintly. Rendezvous, Pont Neuf, minuit. A meeting, a place, an hour. The paper was not proof, not yet, but it was more than silence. He tucked it carefully into his coat and climbed back to the street. Midnight was not far. He walked the length of the embankment, his thoughts steady, his body unhurried. At the Pont Neuf, the city gathered itself into shadows and echoes, the oldest bridge carrying centuries of secrets. The lamps glowed weakly, their reflections rippling in the dark current. He waited. The minutes stretched, carriages crossed, pedestrians hurried past, lovers paused briefly at the parapet and then moved on. And then near the stroke of midnight a solitary figure approached, a man, tall, well-kept, coat-collar turned high. His step was measured, almost theatrical in its restraint. He paused beneath a lamp, and in the dim light Maigret saw the face he had glimpsed in the café, the handsome one, too conscious of his own reflection. Armand Lenoir. He waited, glancing once over his shoulder. No one came. He stood there, smoking, the tip of his cigarette glowing red in the mist. Minutes passed. The meeting failed. Or perhaps the meeting was never meant to occur. At last, with a small gesture of annoyance, he flicked the cigarette into the river and strode away, coat-tails brushing the damp air. Maigret did not follow immediately. He remained at the parapet, watching the ember vanish into the water. The river had received another secret. He thought of the bride again. Had she stood at this very spot, waiting, hesitating, stepping into a carriage that would take her away from the altar and into the arms of a man like Armand? Or had she been drawn here against her will, lured by a letter, deceived by silence? When at last he turned toward home, the bells of a distant church tolled midnight. The sound carried across the water, solemn, inexorable. The city slept, but its shadows did not. Somewhere in those shadows, the bride's fate had already been decided. Maigret walked back along the river, his pipe ember glowing faintly in the mist. He knew the coming days would peel away the layers of silence, one by one, until the truth lay bare. But for now, in the night by the Seine, the city had offered him only a glimpse, a name half confirmed, and a promise of darker revelations yet to come. By morning the newspapers had seized the story, though none of them could agree on its shape. Paris woke to headlines that spoke more of sensation than fact, and in the kiosks men and women paused to read the bold black letters before tossing down their coins. "Bride vanishes before altar," cried one paper. Another, more cautious, suggested mystery carriage near Saint-Étienne. A third, leaning into melodrama, declared the ghost bride of the Seine. Each carried a fragment of truth, but twisted, embroidered, rearranged, until the city itself seemed unsure whether it spoke of a disappearance, an elopement, or a crime too dreadful to name. Maigret sat in his office at the Quai des Orfèvres, the papers spread before him like a gambler's losing hand. He read slowly, pipe clamped between his teeth, smoke rising in heavy clouds. He had long ago ceased to be surprised at the press. They thrived on rumour, on half-heard whispers, on the embroidery of facts until they resembled fairy tales. But he knew the danger as well. The moment a story reached print, it ceased to belong to the people who had lived it and became the city's possession. And once in the city's possession, it grew into something unruly, something that shaped testimony before it was even spoken. The telephone rang twice. Lucas lifted the receiver, murmured into it, then covered the mouthpiece. "Reporters, patron, they want a statement." Maigret shook his head slowly. "Tell them nothing beyond what is certain, that a bride did not arrive at her altar, that we are investigating, nothing more." Lucas relayed the message. Maigret turned back to the papers. One of them carried a line that caught his eye. A supposed witness, unnamed as they often were, claimed to have seen the bride walking near the river the night before the wedding, accompanied by a man in a dark coat. The description was vague, but in its vagueness it acquired power. Any man in Paris could now be pointed at, accused of being that shadow. He folded the paper, tapped it against his pipe bowl. This was how rumours grew, seeded by fear, watered by imagination, harvested by men who had never left their desks. Soon enough, neighbours would repeat it as truth, and families would believe it had always been so. At noon he left the office, his coat collar turned up against the drizzle, and walked the boulevards. The kiosks displayed the newspapers in neat rows, their headlines shouting louder than the voices of the vendors. He paused near one kiosk where a small crowd had gathered. A woman with a scarf tied under her chin read aloud to those who could not spare the coins. "They say she ran away with her lover," she declared, her voice carrying with relish. "Imagine, on the day of her wedding. Poor groom, Poor family. A man spat into the gutter. Or perhaps she was taken. These things happen. The police never tell us the whole. The crowd murmured, heads shaking, eyes narrowing with suspicion that had no object. Maigret moved on unnoticed, his pipe smoke mingling with the fog. He had seen it before, how the city itself became an investigator, how it invented answers where none yet existed. And sometimes, in its inventions, it stumbled on to truths the police had not yet uncovered. He stopped at a cafe on the boulevard, ordered a glass of wine, and sat by the window. On the next table, two clerks argued over the case with the certainty of men who had read a single headline. One insisted she had been seen boarding a provincial train. The other swore she had drowned herself in the Seine. Each leaned forward, stabbing fingers on the table, their voices rising with the excitement of debate. Neither noticed the heavy man in the overcoat listening beside them. When he returned to the quay, Janvier was waiting with news. We traced the poste restante letters. Armand Lenoir received 2 envelopes this past week, both from the same hand, though unsigned. The clerk recalls them because they were scented lavender. He said the man smiled when he collected them. Maigret grunted. Lavender. He remembered the faint fragrance that had lingered when Lenoir left the café, a scent too precise to be coincidence. He asked for the envelopes. They were brought, but both had been burned at the edges, as if someone had tried to destroy them before discarding them. Only fragments remained. Half words, a line that might have been a plea or a warning. He held the brittle scraps in his hand, smoke from his pipe curling around them, and felt the case tighten. That evening, as he walked home, the city seemed noisier than usual. In every café, on every corner, men and women were speaking of the bride. Some spoke with pity, others with disdain, still others with excitement. She had become a story, an emblem, a mirror for the city's own longings and fears. And Armand Lenoir's shadow stretched longer with every telling, though few knew his name. He was already the villain in the popular imagination, whether guilty or not. At dinner, Madame Maigret observed quietly, "It will be harder now. Everyone will want their version to be true." He nodded. "Yes, and the truth will resist them all." Later, as he smoked by the window, the press boys ran through the streets with the evening edition, shouting new headlines. He heard their cries drifting upward, saw the flicker of lamps as neighbors leaned out to call for papers. He thought again of the bride, of her veil in the fog, of her absence that had become the city's obsession. She was no longer a girl who vanished. She was a myth in the making. And myths were the most dangerous suspects of all, because they bent reality to their shape. Maigret exhaled smoke slowly, watching it drift into the night. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would return to the facts, the glove, the ribbon, the lavender-scented envelopes. But tonight he listened to the city, to the way rumour clattered against cobblestones and echoed off the river. In that noise, too, there might be clues. For Paris always spoke, even when it lied. The rain had ceased by dawn, but the streets of Paris still glistened, as though the city had been polished in sorrow. Maigret walked slower than usual, pipe in hand, his thoughts circling the case that had grown like ivy around a wall, twisting, clinging, hiding the shape beneath. The newspapers had done their part, filling the air with rumours, making the bride a phantom of the Seine, an eloper, a tragic figure who might have chosen death. But Maigret knew better. Beneath the noise there was always a room, a place where the truth waited in silence. By mid-morning, Lucas returned from his rounds with news. A concierge on Rue Saint-Honoré remembered him, he said. Armand Lenoir, not by that name, but by the scent. Lavender. He rented a small apartment on the top floor, paid in cash, came and went at strange hours. The concierge says he kept the shutters closed even in summer. Maigrè's eyes narrowed. An apartment hidden in plain sight. Not the kind a man takes if he wishes to live, but the kind he takes if he wishes to disappear. He finished his pipe in silence, then rose and took his coat. "Show me." The building was narrow, wedged between a shop that sold gloves and a tobacconist where the air was thick with smoke even from the doorway. The concierge was a small woman in a wool shawl, her hair grey, but her eyes sharp. She led them up the winding staircase that smelled of cabbage and damp plaster, her slippers whispering on the stone. At the top floor, beneath the eaves, she stopped before a door with peeling paint. "He hasn't been here in days," she said, "but you'll find his smell. Always the lavender." Maigré thanked her with a nod and pushed the door open. The lock had been simple, the kind a coin might persuade, but someone had left it loose, as though the room itself wished to be entered. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with dust and the faint, persistent perfume of lavender that clung to the curtains, the cushions, even the wood of the furniture. The apartment was scarcely more than 2 rooms, a narrow parlour with a table, 2 chairs, and a trunk. A bedroom with a single iron bed, sheets unwashed, blankets folded carelessly. The shutters were drawn tight, letting in only slivers of light that cut across the dust like blades. On the table lay a glass half full of cloudy water, and beside it a book of poems with its spine cracked. Maigré moved slowly, as if the walls themselves might speak. He opened drawers with his heavy hands, examined the wardrobe where 2 suits hung, one dark, one lighter, both too well cared for to match the poverty of the room. In the trunk he found papers, envelopes torn, letters never sent, receipts for small purchases, none bearing his true name. But there were scraps, fragments. In one envelope, pressed flat, lay a pressed flower, brittle with age. On the back of a torn sheet, a woman's hand had written a single phrase, "Ne m'oublie pas," "Do not forget me." Lucas hovered near the door, uneasy. "It doesn't look like a criminal's lair," he muttered. Maigré grunted. "No, but it looks like a man's secret. That is often the same thing." In the bedroom he sat heavily on the iron bed, the springs groaning beneath his weight. From this position he could see the room as its occupant had seen it, the table with its half-empty glass, the book of poems, the trunk with its scattered letters. A man had lived here, hidden from the world, but waiting too. Not waiting for the city, not even for the police, waiting for her, the bride. On the mantel above the small stove, he noticed a photograph in a cracked frame. It was not of the bride herself, but of a street scene. Saint-Étienne, the church square, blurred figures in Sunday clothes. In the background, faint, almost accidental, was the silhouette of a young woman in white. The image was grainy, indistinct, but Maigré felt the hairs rise on the back of his neck. Armand had kept this fragment, this half-ghost, as though it were a treasure. He rose and examined the shutters. The latch was loose, the kind that might open in the night with a push. Beyond, the city stretched, roofs glistening, chimneys smoking. He imagined Armand standing here, smoking, watching the world, without letting the world watch him. A man who lived in the margins, feeding on glimpses, weaving them into a story more real to him than the truth. Lucas shifted. "Shall I bring the cousin here? Perhaps she will recognize something." "Not yet," Maigré said. "This room is not ready to speak to her. It must speak to us first." He crouched beside the trunk again, his thick fingers sifting the papers. One scrap caught his eye, an envelope addressed but never posted. The writing was feminine, delicate, but the ink smudged, Mon cher Armand. The rest was unfinished, the pen lifted mid-thought. It spoke of hesitation, of a heart pulled in two directions. He folded it carefully, slipped it into his pocket. The concierge returned, peering into the room. "Will you take him away?" she asked, half hopeful, half afraid. Maigret studied her. "Why did you never report him?" She shrugged, pulling the shawl tighter around her shoulders. "He paid on time. He caused no trouble. And besides, monsieur, we all have our secrets. Some prefer them behind shutters." The commissioner said nothing. He understood. Secrets were the true currency of Paris. They passed more swiftly than coins, weighed more heavily than debts. He closed the shutters again, left the apartment as they had found it, and locked the door with a quiet click. On the stairs he paused, pipe smoke drifting around him. "This is not where she disappeared," he said to Lucas, "but it is where she was remembered, and remembering can be as dangerous as forgetting." Back at the quay, he laid the envelope, the pressed flower, the torn note, and the photograph on his desk. They were fragments only, but together they suggested a room not of violence, but of longing, of obsession, of love, twisted by secrecy. Whether the bride had stepped willingly into that shadow or been pulled, he could not yet say. But Armand Lenoir was no longer only a name. He was a man who kept apartments hidden, who treasured glimpses, who wrote and received letters scented with lavender. Night fell again, and with it the silence of the river. Maigret leaned at his window, pipe glowing. The city spread below. He thought of the hidden apartment, of its dust, its shutters, its photograph. He thought of the bride who had not reached her altar, and of the man who had built a sanctuary of shadows to keep her image alive. Somewhere between them lay the truth. Tomorrow, he knew, the silence would break, for rooms like that could not remain hidden forever. They always spilled their secrets at last, as surely as the river spilled into the sea. It was late when the first whisper of confession arrived, carried not by telegram or letter, but by the uneven steps of a man who crossed the Quai des Orfèvres with the hesitancy of someone approaching his own judgment. The sergeant at the door stopped him, asked his name, and received only a muttered reply. Lenoir. Not bold, not defiant, just a syllable, surrendered as if it had grown too heavy to carry. Maigret was in his office, the lamplight pooled on the desk, his pipe smoke curling lazily into the ceiling. He heard the footsteps in the corridor, the murmur of the sergeant's voice. Then the door creaked open. Armand Lenoir entered, hat in his hands, coat damp from the night. He looked different than he had beneath the lamps of the Pont Neuf, stripped now of his polish, his careful posture sagging. His eyes were tired, rimmed red, the eyes of a man who had fought too long against silence. "Sit," Maigret said simply, gesturing to the chair across the desk. Lenoir obeyed, lowering himself as though the wood might splinter beneath him. For a moment, neither spoke. Maigret studied the man's hands, long fingers, restless, tapping against the brim of the hat. They were not the hands of a labourer. Too clean, too supple. Hands that knew pens, cards, gestures. Hands that had perhaps traced the line of a veil. Finally, Lenoir spoke, his voice low. "I know you've been looking for me." Maigret tamped his pipe with a deliberate calm. "Not only you, for her." Lenoir's gaze flickered, as though the word her burned brighter than all else. "She came to me," he whispered. "Not at the church, before, days before. She said she could not go through with it. She said she was drowning." Maigret let the words hang. He did not lean forward, did not interrupt. He allowed silence to press upon the man until the rest spilled out. We met in cafes, Lenoir continued. We walked by the river, always at night. She was afraid of being seen. She said the marriage was her parents' wish, not hers. She loved... His voice broke. He pressed the hat tighter between his palms. She loved me. The commissioner's expression did not change, though inside he felt the weight of the word. Love. It was always at the center of such stories, and always it twisted into something unrecognizable once examined. He drew on his pipe, smoke veiling his face. And yet she vanished. Lenoir's head bowed. We planned to leave. I arranged the apartment. You found it, didn't you? I know you did. She was to come there on the morning of the wedding. She promised. Did she? Maigret asked quietly. Yes. The word was a plea. I waited. I had letters from her. She wanted to escape. You must believe me. Maigret reached into his drawer, withdrew the fragments gathered from the hidden apartment, the lavender-scented scraps, the unfinished letter, the pressed flower. He spread them on the desk like cards. These. Lenoir's eyes filled. His fingers trembled above the paper but did not touch. Yes, hers. Maigret's gaze remained steady. They speak of hesitation, of doubt, not of certainty. The man flinched. She was afraid, that is all. Afraid of hurting them, afraid of scandal. But with me she was... He stopped, choked on the word. The room fell silent, save for the ticking of the clock. Outside, the muffled clatter of hooves echoed on the quay, fading into distance. At last, Maigret said, "And the day of the wedding, the cousin says she vanished between her doorway and the church. A carriage was seen. A glove was left. A ribbon found." Lenoir's eyes darted, his breath quickened. She meant to come to me. I waited. The shutters closed, the table set, the bed ready. She never came. His voice dropped. Perhaps they stopped her. Perhaps they knew. Or perhaps, Maigret said, she chose otherwise. Lenoir shook his head violently. No, you don't understand. She was mine. She loved me. His voice cracked into desperation. If she had a choice, she would have come. There it was. The confession not of crime, but of obsession. A truth written in shadows, unsteady, incomplete. Maigret leaned back, pipe embers glowing. He knew men like this, men who mistook longing for destiny, secrecy for devotion, men who believed silence was proof of love. You believe she is alive? Maigret said flatly. I know it, Lenoir whispered. Somewhere she waits. Maigret let him go on, let him tangle himself in words. Each sentence was both confession and denial, revealing less about the bride than about the man who claimed her. Lenoir was no murderer, not yet proven, but he was guilty of something else, of building a prison out of his own desire and inviting her into it. When the clock struck midnight, Maigret rose. He closed the drawer, locked the fragments away again. You will remain here tonight, he told Lenoir. Not as a prisoner, as a witness to your own words. The man sagged, relieved, as though even confinement was gentler than the weight of silence he had carried. Later, alone in his office, Maigret stood by the window, pipe smoke curling into the night. He thought of the bride's absence, of the groom's silence, of the cousin's nervous hands. He thought of Lenoir's voice, cracked by longing. A confession had been given, but it was written in shadows, its lines blurred, its truth uncertain. It was not enough. The Seine glimmered faintly in the distance, carrying the reflections of lamps. Somewhere in the city, perhaps, a woman lived still, hidden by choice or by force. Or perhaps the river itself had taken her, as the newspapers whispered. But Maigret did not believe in ghosts, nor in accidents that aligned too neatly. He believed in people, in their frailties, in the way love and fear could twist into decisions from which there was no return. He exhaled smoke, heavy, slow. Tomorrow he would seek the cousin again. Tomorrow he would press the silences harder. For now he allowed the city to sleep, its rumours drifting like mist, its truths waiting in rooms yet unopened. And in the dim office of the Quai des Orfèvres, Armand Lenoir sat with his head in his hands, whispering the name of the bride into the silence, as though the sound alone might conjure her. The bells of Saint-Étienne rang again, though this time their sound carried not joy, but a weary echo, as if the metal itself had grown tired of expectation. Days had passed since the vanished wedding, days filled with rumours, with fragments of confession, with the lavender scent of a man who loved too much and perhaps not wisely. Yet the altar still stood empty, as bare as on the morning when the bride had failed to appear. And Maigret, pipe in hand, stood once more in the square, watching as Paris went about its business, with the half-indifference it reserved for other people's tragedies. The newspapers had grown quiet now, the headlines had shrunk to smaller columns, their drama spent. The bride who never reached the altar was fading into the long list of mysteries Paris carried in its pockets, pulled out now and then in cafes for argument, then folded away again. But for Maigret the case had not faded. It lay heavy in him, not because the facts remained tangled, but because the truth, when it emerged, was less a revelation than a sorrow. The cousin had broken at last. Under questioning, her fragile voice admitted what her hands had betrayed all along. She had known of Armand. She had even carried letters between him and the bride, tucked in her glove, hidden beneath her shawl. She swore she had done it only out of loyalty, out of love for the girl who trusted her. But on the morning of the wedding, when the bride whispered that she could not go on, that she wished to flee, the cousin had panicked. She had walked with her only as far as Rue des Ursulines, then let her slip away toward the carriage that waited with curtains drawn. It was no abduction, no violence, a choice. The bride had chosen to step into that carriage, to vanish into the fog before the bells could bind her to the altar. Yet choice was not the same as freedom. For where had the carriage taken her? Not to Nevers, not to any provincial refuge. The telegram from the station master, so earnest in its certainty, had been mistaken or misled by resemblance. The bride had gone instead to the hidden apartment on Rue Saint-Honoré, the place Lenoir had prepared with his lavender scent and his shuttered windows. She had entered, sat in the room with its half-empty glass, its book of poems, its pressed flower. And there, after a night of silence, she had left again. Alone. No one saw her after that. Not the concierge, not the neighbours, not the clerks at the poste restante. She had vanished into the city not as a victim carried away, but as a woman fleeing both altar and lover, unwilling to belong wholly to either. This was the truth Maigret pieced together from fragments, from silences, from the trembling confessions of Lenoir himself. The man swore she had loved him, had promised him, had meant to stay. But his tears, his obsession, his desperation told a different story. She had come to him out of fear of the altar, not out of certainty of love. And when she saw the narrowness of his hidden apartment, the dust and the closed shutters, she had understood she could not breathe there either. So she had walked away, into Paris, into its endless streets, its fog, its anonymity. Maigret stood before the altar now, pipe smoke curling beneath the vaulted roof. The church was empty save for a sacristan arranging candles. The groom had left the city, his family had drawn their curtains tight. The cousin had retreated into silence again, her confession wrung from her like water from a cloth, and Armand Lenoir remained in custody, not for murder, not even for abduction, but because the law required him to answer for his deceptions, his lies, his false names. He was not guilty of blood, but he was guilty of shadows. The commissioner walked slowly down the aisle, his heavy steps echoing. At the altar, he paused, resting his hand on the cold stone. He imagined her standing there, veil trembling, eyes full of doubt. He imagined the groom beside her, pale and proud. He imagined the cousin twisting her hands, the family watching, the bells ringing. And then he imagined the absence, the silence, the empty space where the bride should have been. That absence had become louder than any vow. In truth, the city would never know what became of her. Some would swear she drowned herself in the Seine, her white dress sinking into black water. Others would whisper she lived still, hidden under another name in a provincial town, working behind a shop counter, her hair cut short. Still others would make her a ghost, drifting eternally between altar and river, haunting the square with her unseen footsteps. Paris loved such stories, and Paris would keep them alive. But Maigret knew better. He knew she was not ghost, nor martyr, nor myth. She was only a young woman who had been pressed between duty and desire until both suffocated her. And so she had chosen neither. She had slipped away into the anonymity that only a great city can give, vanishing not into water, but into life itself. He exhaled, pipe ember, glowing faintly. Cases did not always end with handcuffs, with confessions neat and final. Some ended like this, in silence, in absence, in the recognition of human frailty. The truth was not triumphant, it was only sad. As he left the church, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the roofs and chimneys, the spire etched against a clearing sky. He walked across the square, heavy coat brushing against his legs, and felt the familiar weariness that came when a case was finished, not with resolution, but with acceptance. That evening at home, Madame Maigret set the table with quiet hands. He ate slowly, the stew warm, the bread fresh. When she asked nothing, he volunteered only a single phrase. She walked away. Madame Maigret nodded, as if she had known all along. Better that, she said softly, than to be buried alive at an altar. He looked at her, at the calm certainty in her eyes, and felt the heaviness in him ease. Yes, she was right. Better to vanish into the unknown than to be bound by a vow that was not freely chosen. Later, as he sat by the window with his pipe, the lamps flickered on along the Seine. The river flowed steadily, carrying its secrets as it always had. Somewhere beyond the glow of those lamps, a woman lived, unnamed, unseen, but alive. She might have taken work, might have changed her dress, might even have smiled again. The city would never know her story. But Maigret was content to let it rest. For him the case was closed not by arrest nor by confession, but by the quiet recognition that sometimes justice lies not in answers, but in understanding. The bride had not reached the altar, but she had reached freedom in whatever shape it took. And so the bells of Saint-Étienne tolled on, their echo fading into the fog, while the commissioner sat in the glow of his lamp, pipe smoke curling upward, listening to the city breathe. The end